Hi, I'm Reese. I was labeled the lazy one, the emotional one, the one not fit to inherit. My sister said I was unstable. She told my parents I was a liability. And one night, they believed her enough to hit me. But that wasn't the part that broke me. What broke me was the plan. The quiet meetings, the trust documents rewritten behind my back, the locks changed on my childhood home. And then, a recording, a voice. Hers, saying, "Just push her a little more. How far would your family go to erase you from your own story?" The morning air in Sacramento was sharp with early fall. I had woken up before the sun rose, hoping to get a quiet start. The kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon from the tea I brewed last night. I poured a cup of black coffee, leaned against the counter, and opened my email. I wasn't expecting anything significant, just the usual updates, bills, and an occasional message from Tamsin. But there it was, a voicemail notification from Isolde. I hesitated before tapping play. Her voice slid through the speaker, sugar-coated but stiff with calculation. "Hey Reese, just checking in. You really should get yourself together before Dad reviews the succession plans. We all want what's best, especially for the company's image." The message ended with a gentle laugh that didn't match the chill crawling up my neck. Succession plans? Company image? I stared at my phone, replaying her words in my mind. Isolde had a way of wrapping insults in ribbons. She didn't raise her voice. She just dropped hints like landmines. What got me wasn't what she said. It was how it sounded like everyone had already had this conversation, without me. I sipped my coffee, trying not to read into it. But that knot in my stomach? It wasn't new. It was old. It was familiar. I moved to my laptop, determined to brush it off and get through some freelance design work. As the screen lit up, my inbox chimed. A forwarded message popped up at the top. Sent from my account. To Tamsin. I froze. The subject line read, "Can't do this much longer." I opened it and scrolled. It was a thread, a deeply personal exchange between me and Tamsin, only this one looked wrong. Some lines were mine, I remembered typing them, but others, edited, paraphrased, chopped and rearranged to sound like I was unhinged, bitter. It made me sound like a ticking time bomb. Attached at the bottom was a note. "Vernon thought you should see this." I couldn't breathe. I rushed downstairs. Vernon wasn't in the kitchen. I walked past the hall toward his study, heart thudding. Through the crack in the door, I saw the printout on his desk. My words, twisted, laid bare in ink. He hadn't confronted me. He hadn't even asked. It was already decided. That's when it hit me. Not just the violation of my privacy, but the intention behind it. Someone wanted to make me look unstable, ungrateful, lazy, maybe even dangerous. Only one person had both the access and the motive. Isolde. But suspicion wasn't proof. Not yet. I backed away quietly. I didn't want a confrontation. I wanted clarity. And whatever this was, it wasn't going to end with a message or an email. Later that afternoon, I found myself sorting laundry. Anything to feel normal. The hum of the dryer filled the silence while my mind spun. I remembered last Thanksgiving. We were at Aunt Val's house. Isolde had stood beside me, wineglass in hand, laughing with some old college friend of hers. "Reese, she's still finding herself, 10 years later," she said with that perfect, polished smile. Everyone laughed. I laughed too. Not because it was funny, but because it was easier than correcting the narrative. I remember glancing at my father then, hoping for even a glance of support. Instead, he just sighed and topped off his drink. That laugh haunted me more than the line itself. It wasn't just once. It was always in passing, always with charm. That was the trick of Isolde. She didn't need to shout to be cruel. That night, I sat on my bed with an old leather-bound notebook I hadn't touched in months. I opened to a blank page and just stared for a minute before I started writing. Is it me? Or is this house turning into a stage where I'm always the punchline? I paused, then kept going. I was the helper, the comforter, The quiet one. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe they took my quiet for absence, or weakness, or worse, permission. I underlined the last line hard. Trust no one blindly, not even blood. It was one of those nights where even silence buzzed. I turned off the light, but my mind kept replaying that voicemail, that email, that stupid toast from last year. Just as I pulled the blanket over my shoulder, my phone buzzed. A message lit up the screen. It was from Isolde. Dinner tonight. Dad wants to talk about the company future. Don't be late. It's important. I stared at the message, thumb hovering above the screen. When Isolde said something was important, it was never about me. It was about control. I didn't respond to Isolde's message. I didn't need to. She'd sent it like an order, not an invitation. And I'd already learned the hard way. Refusing those kinds of orders only gave her more reason to tighten her grip. So, at 6 sharp, I was in the driveway, parked behind Delora's Lexus, wondering if anyone inside even realized I'd never agreed to be there. The front door was slightly ajar when I stepped in. Laughter floated in from the dining room, tight, scripted. I slipped off my coat and walked toward the sound. Isolde greeted me first, of course. She stood at the head of the table, wine glass in hand, her smile perfectly practiced. "There she is," she announced. "We can finally start." The table had 10 seats, everyone taken except the far end next to Delora. No one shifted. No one offered to make room elsewhere. I walked to my place without a word, nodding politely to a few aunts I barely spoke to, and one of Vernon's business partners I hadn't seen since I was 26. Delora smiled without showing her teeth. "Glad you could make it." I didn't reply. I sat, adjusted my napkin, which I realized was missing entirely, and stared at the unlit candle in the center of the table. The meal was already served. Isolde had done her part, assumed hostess, plated the dinner, orchestrated the mood. Vernon looked oddly detached, as if he'd walked into someone else's life by mistake. "So, Reese," he said after a beat, his tone light but rehearsed, "how's your freelance situation going?" Not, "How's work?" Not, "How are you?" Just enough implication to draw blood in front of an audience. I opened my mouth, but Isolde beat me to it. "She's still figuring it out," she said cheerfully. "You know how creative types are. So much energy, so little structure." A few chuckles followed. Then Delora, as if on cue, added, "It's hard to stay motivated without real deadlines, I guess. I admire how free you keep your time." I blinked slowly. I wasn't sure if I'd expected someone to jump in, maybe to pivot the conversation, maybe to say, "Give her a break." But the silence that followed told me everything. No one planned to. I tried to answer. I really did. "I've actually been consulting on a new space downtown. Tamsin's firm brought me in." "That's lovely," Isolde interrupted, waving it off like I was offering a weather update. "By the way, Vernon, did you tell everyone about the renovation plans? We're thinking of opening the new West Wing early." And just like that, I was erased. I sat through the rest of the dinner, barely tasting my food. My fork scraped porcelain more than it lifted anything edible. They spoke around me, over me, through me. Toward the end of the meal, Isolde stood and raised her glass. "Let's toast to Dad, of course, but also to Reese." I froze. "She's the free spirit of the family," she said with a smile so wide it hurt to look at. "We don't always know where she's headed, but it's always interesting." Polite laughter rippled across the table. Vernon smiled, tapped his glass with his knife, and moved on to the next toast before I could respond. I didn't know what I would have said anyway. Nothing I said would have mattered. When dessert was cleared, I offered to help with the dishes. No one objected. I carried plates into the kitchen, breathing in the sharp scent of lemon detergent, trying to count backwards from 10 to calm my hands. I rinsed a tray of glasses, one by one. Isolde passed behind me to grab a towel. "Don't make this about you," she said softly, drying her hands. "It was just a toast." I looked at her then, really looked, not at the polished hair or the calculated smile, but at the vacant eyes beneath all that effort. "I'm not making it anything," I said, more to myself than to her. She left without another word. Back at the table, my plate was still there, still empty, still without a napkin. I picked it up and brought it to the sink. One more thing to clean. Later, in my room, I opened my journal. The leather felt cold against my skin. I flipped past the last entry and pressed pen to paper. "If they laugh at me when I'm trying," I wrote, "what will they do if I fall?" The words stared back, darker than usual. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. One new message, no name, just a number I didn't recognize. One word. "Watch." I didn't sleep after that message. I stared at the word "watch" until the screen dimmed, and even then, my thoughts refused to slow down. There was no reply, no context, just that single word, echoing louder than any of the conversations at dinner. By the time the sun slipped through the curtains, I was still dressed. I hadn't even gotten under the covers. I washed my face, brushed my hair, and tied it back. No makeup, no earrings, no pretense. I needed to face the day exactly as I was. Vernon called me into his office before breakfast. The timing wasn't unusual, but his tone, when he said my name, was too casual. Like we were strangers passing in a hallway. He didn't offer a seat, just reached into a drawer and handed me a folder, thick with legal paper. I held it like it might burn. "We've drafted the initial trust and distribution plans," he said, like he was discussing paint samples. "You're not on this version. It's a temporary outline." Temporary, like me. I flipped open the first page. There were paragraphs about executive duties, property divisions, intellectual holdings, all listed under one name. Isolde. Vernon kept talking, something about not wanting to add pressure while I was still figuring things out. I couldn't hear most of it. My fingers tightened on the edge of the paper. The weight of the folder suddenly felt heavy, not from content, but confirmation. He wasn't trying to protect me. He was documenting what they already believed about me. Still figuring things out, still not ready, still just a placeholder. I nodded slowly, even though I didn't understand yet whether I was angry or just numb. My voice stayed behind when I left the room. The day dragged on, but nothing else really happened. No one checked on me. No one mentioned the meeting. I was invisible again, just the way they preferred it. That night, I lay the folder on my bed and opened it page by page. I didn't read every word. I just looked for my name. It showed up once. At the bottom of the final sheet, potential advisory input, pending stability. Stability. The word made my stomach twist, as if I were a risk, a liability, a defective part they were still deciding whether to keep or discard. I walked to my desk, opened the drawer, and pulled out the small candle I hadn't touched in months. It was the same one I'd kept burning every night during Vernon's recovery. Back when I made soup, handled his emails, tracked his meds. Back when I believed being present meant being seen. I lit it. The flame flickered, casting shadows on the draft beside it. I stared until my eyes blurred. And then I remembered something. A night from 2 years ago. The company gala. We were standing under the white tent in the garden behind the office. Vernon had just finished thanking donors when someone asked about the family. I was nearby, refilling my water glass, when I heard him say, "Reese stayed with me the whole time during recovery. She's got a big heart." For a second, I felt something warm rise in my chest. But then Isolde chimed in from across the table. "Yeah, she's great at sitting around. Must be why she's still freelancing." Everyone laughed. Even Vernon gave a half smile before taking another sip of wine. I remember folding my napkin too neatly that night, pretending I didn't hear. That was the last time I remember him saying something kind about me in public. And even then, it didn't last more than a minute. Now, sitting in my room, with legal pages scattered across my bed, and a candle barely holding its flame, I knew. They hadn't changed their view of me. They just finally put it in writing. I reached for my journal, flipping past the recent pages. I didn't hesitate. "They've always seen me as a side note," I wrote. "What's worse, I believed them. Until now." I paused, tapping the pen against the edge. "There's something hollow in their love. It has shape but no weight." I closed the book, but I didn't put it away. Later that night, after brushing my teeth and pulling on a sweater, I opened my laptop to check emails. I wasn't expecting anything, but there it was. No subject line, no signature, just, "Check your timeline." Attached was a screenshot. A calendar invite, dated a week earlier, titled, "Formal Trust Sign-Off, Isolde Sole Executor." I stared at the timestamp, so it was never temporary. I stared at the screen until it went dark. Formal Trust Sign-Off, Isolde Sole Executor. I didn't need the timestamp to know it had already happened. This wasn't a draft, it was a decision, and I wasn't part of it. I closed the laptop slowly, fingers lingering on the lid, like maybe it could change what I'd just seen. But it was done. They didn't just forget me, they removed me, on purpose, with signatures and schedules and silence. The next day, I left the house around noon for a meeting with a design client in Midtown. The drive was routine, the small talk predictable, the coffee stale. But it felt like the only part of my life still untouched by the house I no longer recognized. When I pulled into the driveway 2 hours later, the afternoon sun was still high. I reached for my keys, approached the front door, and slipped one into the lock. It didn't turn. I tried again, slower, steadier, but the key didn't budge. I looked at the door handle, then the key in my hand, then back at the door. Someone had changed the lock. I stood there for a few seconds, confused, more than angry. I rang the bell once, then again. The sound echoed behind the heavy oak door, like it belonged to someone else's home. Finally, Delora opened it. Just barely. She didn't swing it open like someone greeting family. She cracked it like a landlord answering a tenant she didn't recognize. "Oh," she said, eyebrows lifting slightly. "You're back earlier than I thought." "My key doesn't work," I said, holding it up like proof that I existed. She smiled. "Your father had the locks changed. Security reasons. You should have told us you were staying out so late." I glanced at my phone. "It's 3 o'clock." She gave a small laugh and opened the door just wide enough for me to step through. The message was clear. It wasn't about time. It was about control. This was how they did it now. Quietly, bureaucratically, like I was a risk they'd been advised to mitigate. That night, after dinner, I asked Vernon about the lock. He barely looked up from his tablet. "It's nothing personal. Isolde had concerns. You've been coming and going without saying much. It's just about safety." "Safety?" I repeated. "You should check in more," he said, tapping his screen. "This isn't a hostel." I opened my mouth to respond, but stopped. He wasn't speaking from conviction. He was repeating someone else's script. Probably hers. A few days earlier, Isolde had invited me to lunch with Aunt Val. One of those rare moments when she acted like she wanted sisterhood. The restaurant was familiar, one we used to visit with Mom on Sundays. That familiarity made me lower my guard. We ordered salads. She smiled too much, asked about my projects, seemed genuinely interested. But midway through the meal, her questions changed tone. "So, what's the plan after this freelance phase? Have you thought about going back to school, or something with more structure?" I blinked. "I have clients. I'm booked out for the next 2 months." She nodded, polite. "That's good. I just worry sometimes. You seem tired, stretched." Aunt Val chimed in, concern lining her voice. "Is everything okay, Reese? You've seemed off lately. Vernon mentioned something about you having a hard time focusing." I froze. That hadn't come from me. It wasn't a lunch. It was an evaluation. Later, I found out Aunt Val called Vernon afterward, asked if I was mentally sound, wondered aloud whether I was in the right headspace to make major decisions. And just like that, a lunch turned into a witness statement. I sat on my bed that night, hands numb from clenching my fists too long. I opened my journal, not to write feelings, but facts. Dates, names, patterns. I wasn't journaling anymore. I was documenting. "They're not just doubting me," I wrote. "They're framing me." I didn't need proof of motive. I needed proof of method, so I wrote down everything: the lock change, the lunch, the calendar invite, the missing napkin, the phrasing Vernon used. Not for anyone else, just for me. For the part of me that had started to believe maybe they were right. I was halfway through recording a note when I heard it. Isolde's voice drifting down the hallway. She was on the phone, laughing softly. "If we can show she's unfit," she said, "we don't need her signature anyway." There was a pause. Then she said my name. I didn't wait to hear the rest. I didn't need to. I walked back to my room, each step heavier than the last. They wanted to shrink me down into a problem, but I was already learning how to become a threat. I barely slept. My thoughts flickered like static, louder than any voice around me. By the time the house settled into quiet, I had already decided. I wasn't going to tiptoe anymore. It was after 9 when I came downstairs. The living room lights were dim, but Vernon sat near the window, the glow of his reading lamp outlining the sharp lines of his face. A folder rested on the arm of the chair. He didn't look up right away. Then he said, without inflection, "We need to talk." I knew the tone. It wasn't concerned. It was clinical. I stood across from him, not bothering to sit. He opened the folder and pulled out several printed pages. "These were sent from your email," he said, spreading them on the coffee table. "To several contacts, including Tamsin, your aunt, even one to the HOA board." I frowned, stepping closer. They were screenshots, messages I had never written, lines accusing my family of financial manipulation, threatening lawsuits, and ranting about being robbed blind. Some were time-stamped only days earlier. "I didn't write any of this," I said, my voice steady. Vernon raised a brow. "Then how do you explain the timestamps? The headers?" Before I could reply, Isolde entered from the hallway, holding a cup of tea like she'd just wandered into the scene. She set it down gently, then looked at Vernon and sighed. "We should have known," she said, her voice soft with false concern. "She's not herself. I've tried to help." I turned to her, fury rising through my ribs. "You think this will hold up?" She didn't flinch. "I think you need rest, Reese. You've been under a lot of pressure. Maybe this is your way of asking for help." It was such a familiar twist, the kind that makes you question your own footing. But I was done letting them narrate over me. "I never sent these, and you know it." Vernon stood. His face was tight, unreadable. That tone, right there, is exactly the problem. He stepped forward, and before I could step back, his palm struck my cheek. I didn't stumble, but everything inside me did. Delora gasped from the kitchen doorway, but said nothing. Isolde turned her face slightly, as if in sorrow. She didn't move. The room went silent, except for my breath. I touched my face, not in shock, but to remember this moment. I looked up. "That's the last time you touch me." Then I walked out. My legs carried me up the stairs even as my thoughts spun. My heart wasn't racing. It was slowing down, coldly, methodically. Inside my room, I closed the door gently, then locked it. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I paced. My cheek throbbed, but I barely felt it. I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and clicked into my admin panel. If they were going to build a false case, I was going to dismantle it. Bite by bite. I logged into my email and traced the outgoing messages. Within 5 minutes, I found the pattern. Forwarded domains. A mirrored alias just one letter off from mine. All routed through a shared Wi-Fi IP. The kicker? The origin location. The guest room printer. Isolde's temporary office. They didn't even try to cover their tracks. I leaned back, exhaled, and opened a blank document. "This ends now," I whispered. Later, with the draft still open, I reached for my journal. "He hit me for something I didn't say," I wrote, and believe the one who's been saying everything. I let the ink sink in. This isn't just about trust. This is about territory, and they think I've been trespassing. As I closed the cover, a soft, unfamiliar beep sounded. I looked toward my drawer. A small recorder, one I'd forgotten I ever turned on, flashed red. It had been on, for days. I pressed rewind, then play. The voice came through faint but clear. Once she loses it, we can claim instability. Just push her a little more. It was Isolde. I sat still for a moment. Then I clicked save. If they were building a case against me, it was time I built one of my own. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. There was no alarm, no noise, just the weight of everything that hadn't been said the night before pressing against my chest. The slap hadn't left a visible bruise, but it had marked something else, something deeper. I needed space, not the kind that came from a locked door or cold glances, but space of my own choosing. I made coffee without speaking to anyone, the sound of the grinder too loud in the quiet kitchen. Then I walked into Vernon's study. It wasn't mine to enter, technically, but he'd left the door open the night before, and I figured that said more than words ever would. I wasn't snooping. I just needed a room that wasn't already soaked in someone else's version of me. I started organizing a stack of old paperwork sitting by the window. Some were invoices from the company, others medical bills from his recovery 2 years ago. Beneath them was a leather-bound book, tucked between yellowing receipts. It was my mother's handwriting. My throat tightened. I hadn't seen her script in so long that it felt like a voice returning. I sat down and opened it gently, like the pages might crumble under the weight of time. There were lists, grocery items, notes from doctor visits, short prayers. And then one entry that stopped me. Reese stayed up again last night, wouldn't leave the chair beside his bed. They don't see her because she doesn't shout. But silence like hers? That's love in its loudest form. I traced the ink with my finger. That one paragraph did more to anchor me than anything in the last month. I'd forgotten that someone once saw me whole. Later that day, I cleaned out the rest of the study, but the notebook stayed with me. Back in my room, I placed it on my desk beside my journal and opened to a fresh page. The lists I began weren't emotional. They were factual. Column 1, verifiable events. Column 2, direct quotes. Column 3, who said what, when, and where. I wasn't documenting pain. I was building a case. I downloaded a voice recording app. I labeled a folder on my desktop. Clips. Then I placed small post-it notes in discrete corners of the house, on the hallway baseboard, beneath the upstairs lamp, on the inside of the pantry door. All reminders, all timestamps. I didn't know how far I'd need to go, but I knew now that I had to stop waiting for someone to protect me. 2 days later, I texted Tamsin. Just a simple note. If someone forged messages to discredit you, how would you prove it? She responded within minutes. Start with metadata, then you build a pattern. No questions, no sympathy, just clarity. It was exactly what I needed. That night, I sat down and replayed the audio from the recorder again, not to hear it, but to capture it. I transcribed every word, labeling the file, Instability Narrative, Clip 1. I underlined key phrases in red ink. Push her. Claim unfit. Don't need her signature. I didn't flinch. I didn't pause. This was no longer about feelings. It was about facts. I had just closed the file when I remembered the mailbox. It had been a few days since I checked it, and for once, I wasn't expecting anything from outside this house to matter. But I grabbed the key anyway and stepped into the cool evening air. The front yard was quiet. A few porch lights blinked on across the street. The metal box creaked when I opened it. Inside, beneath a water bill and a flyer for gutter cleaning, was a plain envelope. No return address. I tore it open carefully. Inside was a photo. Just one. Isolde, in her navy blazer, standing in a parking lot next to Vernon's financial advisor. Hand extended, both of them laughing. The date printed at the bottom corner was from 3 weeks before the trust meeting. 3 weeks before I'd even been told there was a draft. I stood there, the envelope in one hand, the photo in the other, under a flickering porch light. If they started planning before they denied it, then someone else was helping them lie. I tucked the photo into the bottom drawer of my desk, careful not to fold the corners. My fingers were cold, half from the night air, half from the truth I had just held. They didn't just shut me out. They planned it, step by step, like a merger, like a strategy. Later that night, after the house went still, I padded barefoot to the kitchen, clutching the recorder in my hand. The only light came from above the stove. I sat at the table and pressed play again. This time, I listened all the way through. Isolde's voice came through clearly. "Let her spiral a bit. Make her think we're just watching. The court will believe it's mental instability." A pause. Delora's voice followed. "Honestly, it's smart. If she pushes back, it just reinforces the point." I paused the recorder and stared at the floor. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I copied the file to a flash drive and renamed it Exit File Phase 1. They thought they were clever, building an image of me that matched their version of the story. But I knew better now. They weren't just reacting, they were engineering. The next morning, I texted Tamsin. She replied immediately, told me to come by after work. I drove to her office, my hands tight on the wheel the whole way. She greeted me with a long look that said she knew not to ask more than I was ready to say. I handed her the email Vernon claimed came from me, the one that triggered everything. She took it without a word, downloaded the attachments, and began scanning with a forensic audio tool and metadata extractor. 15 minutes in, she looked up. "This isn't just sloppy, it's intentional," she said. "Voice cuts, reassembled tones, timestamp gaps. Whoever did this wanted it to sound unhinged, but technical enough to pass if no one looked twice." I folded my arms. "So it's not just forged, it's tailored." Tamsin nodded. "Someone edited you like a memo they wanted on the record, not a person they wanted to protect." That hit harder than I expected. I didn't just feel betrayed, I felt edited. Back home, I stood in front of my wall and began building my own case. Literally. I tacked up printed emails, receipts, notes from the journal, post-its with dates, names, arrows drawn in red pen. At the center, I circled 3 names: Isolde, Delora, Vernon. Then, under each, motive, access, timing. Beneath it all, I wrote in block letters: prove alignment, prove benefit, prove timeline. They had their story. Now, I had mine. But mine was sourced. Later that evening, I sat at my desk with the microphone open. I recorded my own voice. Not to publish, not yet. Just to hear myself speak without being edited. "You want me out of the story," I began, "so you can write a version that never needed me in it." I paused. My voice was calm, no tremor. But I built more than they'll ever admit. And I kept the receipts. I saved the file. That night, as I curled into bed, my laptop pinged with a new email. From a name I didn't recognize, but one I vaguely remembered. Harold, Vernon's former financial assistant. The subject line was short. "Saw something strange a month ago. We need to talk." Attached were server access logs. Detailed, dated, marked by user. Isolde's username was right there. Logged in the week before the draft was allegedly shared with me. So they weren't just preparing to erase me. They were already rehearsing the rewrite. If they thought their power protected them, they forgot who watched them build it. The morning of the party, I woke with a strange calmness. Not numbness, not denial. Just the kind of stillness that comes when you've accepted the storm isn't passing. I brewed a pot of coffee, let it go cold, and sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the closed notebook on my dresser. I hadn't dreamt in weeks, but that night I had. My mother had been standing by the old garden gate in the backyard, the one with peeling paint and the jasmine overgrowth she refused to cut. She didn't say anything. She just looked at me, steady, then placed a hand on my shoulder. It wasn't comforting, it was grounding. I didn't cry when I woke up. I didn't need a sign. But maybe I got one anyway. By evening, I had dressed in all black. Not out of mourning, but message. I tied my hair back, clipped the flash drive to my keychain, and tucked it into my coat pocket. I didn't wear makeup. I didn't bring a gift. I brought the truth. The banquet hall was already crowded when I arrived. White tablecloths, centerpieces of faux hydrangeas, trays of sparkling cider. Vernon was at the head table, surrounded by former colleagues, the current board, and extended family who showed up to be seen. Isolde stood near the podium, her hand resting lightly on the microphone, like a queen prepared to bless the room. I slipped into a seat at the back, unnoticed. It was always easier to fade in than to force your way out of erasure. She started her speech with practiced ease. "Tonight, we honor a man who built not only a company, but a legacy," she beamed. "Our father, a leader, a mentor." Applause, laughter, nods. I stared at the polished silverware. The knife was dull. She continued. "And though not everyone has followed the same path, some have taken longer to find their way, our family stands stronger because of the decisions we've made together." That was her way of saying, "without you." Subtle, calculated, cold. I waited until dessert plates clinked and the servers began to pull back the coffee carafes. Then I stood. I didn't clear my throat. I didn't smile. I just walked to the microphone and took it from its stand. The room dimmed in volume, but the silence didn't come all at once. A few murmurs. Someone dropped a spoon. I spoke clearly. "Before you finish dessert, there's something I think you should all hear." I reached into my coat and pulled out the USB. The tech guy hesitated when I asked for the O cord. I didn't flinch. I plugged in the drive myself. A click, a pause. Then, the voice filled the hall. Isolde's voice. "Let her spiral a bit. Make her think we're just watching. The court will believe it's mental instability." Delora. "Honestly, it's smart." There was no music, no transition, just the sound of betrayal, echoing against 100 plates. People gasped. Some turned to Isolde, others to Vernon. I looked at neither. I stared straight ahead. Isolde tried to smile. "This is out of context." I cut her off. "That line works in private. This isn't private anymore." Vernon didn't move, didn't blink. Then Marjorie stepped forward from the corner of the room. I hadn't seen her until then. She wore a faded cardigan and held her purse tight to her side. "I was there," she said, loud enough to hush the whispers. "It wasn't out of context." A beat passed, then another. Someone stood, someone else left. Power doesn't scream when it shifts. It settles. Quietly, like dust. After the chaos, after Isolde retreated behind a clutch of family friends, and Vernon refused to look me in the eye, I stepped outside. The air was cooler than I expected. Tamsin was waiting by my car. She handed me a sealed envelope. "You were right," she said. "They altered the trust before you were ever told it was just a draft." I held it in both hands. I didn't shake. I didn't even feel angry anymore. I felt ready. They tried to lock me out of the house. Now they'll watch me walk through the front door, with keys they didn't know I had. The morning after, the party felt eerily quiet. I sat in Tamsin's kitchen, watching her unseal the envelope with the same precision she used when drafting legal motions. She laid the papers out across her granite island, flattening each sheet as if it might hold a bomb. "There are 2 versions here," she said. "This one's dated 6 months ago. You're included." She pointed to my name in the original trust draft, printed plainly alongside Vernon's and Isolde's. It wasn't just an honorary mention. I was listed as a co-executor. "And this," she continued, sliding the second document forward, "is the one they finalized and signed a month ago." My name was gone. She leaned in, tapping a handwritten note in the margin of the older version. I read it aloud. "Needs revision per Isolde's restructure." I didn't speak. I didn't need to. It was the final thread of doubt snapping, They hadn't left me out by mistake. They'd removed me with deliberation. I left Tamsin's house with copies in hand, already knowing what came next. That afternoon, while sorting through messages, my phone rang. Unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. Reese? The voice was unfamiliar, but calm. It's Lowell. We haven't met, but I used to be with Isolde. I knew the name. A short-lived engagement 5 years ago, scrubbed from family history like a smudge. I don't want anything from you, he said quickly, but I saw something and figured you'd want to know. He told me he used to courier financial packets for Vernon's estate planning firm. One day, while dropping off a folder, he saw Delora and Isolde standing over the desk, stamping Vernon's signature onto a revision sheet. Vernon wasn't in the room. I asked if he'd already signed it, Lowell said. They told me to mind my job. His voice was firm, but I caught the undercurrent, guilt. When the call ended, I stared at the wall for a long time. They didn't just erase me. They forged the scissors they used to cut me out. By the end of the week, Vernon was served formal notice. Marjorie called me the next morning. I hadn't heard from her since the party. Your aunt called me, sweetie, she said gently. She asked why your name wasn't on anything. I didn't have an answer. Later that day, Delora confronted Vernon in the foyer. The door was open. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but I didn't walk away either. You said it was temporary, she hissed. You said you'd talk to her. Now it's legal. Vernon didn't reply. But silence was its own confession, and the whispers began to spread. The same cousins who'd ignored me at Christmas were now texting me questions thinly veiled as concern. The tide didn't turn with a crash. It shifted quietly, like sand under water. A few days later, I walked the rose path in my mother's old garden. The bushes had bloomed late this year, blush pink, full-bodied. The same roses Isolde once insisted were dead and not worth saving. I knelt, brushing dirt from a plaque we placed for Mom years ago. I wasn't cut out, I said softly. I was buried. Then I stood. But truth blooms where secrets rot. That evening, just as I was settling in with a mug of tea, an email notification blinked on my screen. Subject: Trust Dispute Hearing, set for Tuesday, 10 a.m. Attached: Exhibit List. My name was listed on page 1. Not just as a witness, as a principal. They buried me in paperwork. On Tuesday, I hand it back, 1 page at a time. Tuesday morning came with no hesitation in my bones. I didn't wake with dread. I didn't pause at the window or listen for voices downstairs. I just got up and moved. I packed slowly. Not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to remember every item I chose to take. 1 suitcase, my laptop, a folder of evidence, the leather journal, my mother's notebook. I left everything else. Downstairs, the house was still. Vernon's study door was closed. Delora's coffee cup was on the counter, half full. No one asked where I was going. No one dared to ask why. I placed a sealed envelope in the center of the dining table. It was addressed to Vernon. Inside, a subpoena for the trust hearing and a printed photo from his birthday party. Isolde smiling, USB still plugged into the laptop. Next to it, I slid a pen. He could use it to sign an apology, or to resign. I didn't care which. I didn't slam the door when I left. Quiet exits echo louder than slamming ones. The sun was warm for February. I stepped onto the porch and started down the concrete steps. Halfway to the driveway, my foot slipped on loose gravel. The world tilted just enough for my knees to scrape the sidewalk, palms slapping hard against cold stone. I winced, but didn't cry out. I sat there, winded, knees burning. Then the door creaked behind me. Delora stood on the threshold, arms crossed. She didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't even blink. A shadow shifted in the upstairs window. Isolde's silhouette, arms folded, head tilted. Smiling. I stood up slowly, brushed grit from my palms, and tore a strip from the edge of my scarf to wipe blood from my elbow. I tied it around the scrape, knotted it tight. Pain isn't proof of weakness, it's proof you moved. I didn't look back again. By early afternoon, I was at Tamsin's apartment. She had cleared a space for me on the dining table, already set up with a power strip, notepad, and 2 mugs of tea. No questions, just quiet presence. I opened my laptop, connected to Wi-Fi, and clicked into the shared legal folder. Our attorney appeared on Zoom 5 minutes later. "We've got the witness," she said, referring to Lowell. "We've got timeline documentation, audio proof, forgery indicators, and former employees willing to corroborate." Tamsin leaned into frame. "Now we give them a choice: settle quietly or defend the lie in open court." I didn't smile. I didn't nod. I just said, "We move forward." That evening, I received a ping from a local business digest. Headline: "Family Estate Trust Dispute Sparks Legal Scrutiny, Internal Conflicts." Below the headline, a subtext: "Sources suggest key parties may have engaged in procedural manipulation to alter inheritance outcomes." It was happening. A string of texts followed, some from people I hadn't spoken to in years. "Are you okay?" "I didn't know it was this bad." "She did what?" I didn't answer any of them. Vernon, I was told, began receiving calls. Board members, longtime friends, associates who'd once praised Isolde now asked quiet questions behind closed doors. Damage control began. But damage done by silence takes longer to erase. "They wanted silence," I said to Tamsin that night. "Now they'll have to talk their way out of it." At dusk, Vernon opened the envelope I'd left. Inside, between the subpoena and the photo, I'd included a handwritten note. Just one sentence. "You raised me in silence. Now, silence will raise questions." The envelope sat in Vernon's hand long after the sun went down. He read the note once, then again. He didn't say a word, just folded the paper back into the envelope and walked out of the room. In the quiet that followed, he wandered into what used to be my bedroom. The bed was stripped, the walls bare except for a faint rectangle where my high school diploma used to hang. On the desk, untouched, lay a sketchbook I hadn't taken with me. He opened it slowly. Inside were half-finished drawings, some flowers, some architectural spaces, one of him, seated in a recliner, his face in profile, eyes closed. The same week he came home from the hospital. I'd drawn it during one of the nights I sat by his side while Isolde gave speeches about supporting him, but never showed up past dinner time. He stared at the page for a long time. Delora's voice floated in from the hallway. "You think she'll come back?" Vernon didn't turn. He placed the sketchbook gently on the desk. "She already left," he said quietly. "Long before this." 2 days later, while unpacking a box of books I hadn't touched since college, I found it, wedged between a gardening manual and an old paperback with broken binding. It was my mother's handwriting, on a yellowed sticky note, brittle around the corners, tucked inside the book's cover. "If they ever shut the door," it read, "remember, you were always the garden." I didn't cry. I didn't smile either. But for the first time in a long time, something inside me stopped bracing for impact. They hadn't excluded me from the family. I'd been the one who made it grow. They just forgot. Elsewhere, behind frosted glass and polished hardwood, Isolde sat alone in her office. The morning news had run a brief segment on the upcoming trust hearing. No names, but enough breadcrumbs for anyone who knew where to look. Her inbox was full of flagged messages, some supportive, most not. She opened a browser tab and began reading the comments on the leaked article. "What kind of sister does this?" one read. Then the reply, "What kind of family drives someone to this point?" She stared at the screen. No makeup today, no performance. Just her silence, and a reflection in the laptop screen that looked more like a shadow than a person. She clicked the tab closed. No calls were made, no statements issued. For the first time, she let the silence sit with her. That afternoon, I sat on the same park bench my mother used to rest on after tending the community garden. The roses around it were blooming again, blush and coral, vibrant despite the cold. I don't want revenge, I said. Not to anyone, just to the wind. I wanted truth, and I wanted to live where truth didn't cost me everything. I looked ahead, into nothing in particular. Now I know I can. Back home, I logged into my podcast dashboard. The first draft was ready. I'd written the script weeks ago, but hadn't touched it since. Title: Quiet Power: Stories of People Who Refuse to Disappear. I uploaded the final version, reviewed the settings, and hovered over the button. Then I clicked Schedule to Publish. It would go live in the morning. I didn't burn the house down. I just built a new one, where my voice would never echo empty again. The podcast went live at 7 a.m. I watched the screen as the little scheduled tag disappeared, replaced by a simple word: published. No fanfare, no glitch, just the quiet beginning of something I built on the ashes of what they tried to bury. The intro played back through my earbuds as I sipped my coffee. Some people win by being loud, some by never breaking. I learned to win by refusing to disappear. By mid-morning, comments had started trickling in. This made me cry. Thank you. I've never heard someone say exactly what I've been afraid to admit. I wish I had your courage. It wasn't going viral, but it wasn't meant to. This wasn't noise. This was resonance. Later that day, I sat across the conference table from our attorney. The office was sterile, the chairs stiff, but I felt more grounded than I ever had at that dining room table they once tried to exile me from. She slid a folder toward me. They've agreed to settle. You've been reinstated. I nodded. No questions, no elation. The apology is public, she added. Through the firm, not personal. Good, I said. I don't need personal. Outside, the sky was overcast. The air smelled like it might rain. Isolde had issued a statement, vague and neutral, stepping down for personal reasons, restructuring the board, shifting priorities. Her photo in the business journal was tightly cropped and lacked her usual smile. The comments were mixed. Some called her brave for handling things quietly, others not so kind. I didn't share it. I didn't even bookmark the article. I had signed the papers with steady hands. No trembling, no victory grin, just peace. 3 days later, I visited the cemetery alone. I didn't call Tamsin. I didn't bring flowers at first, just the printed transcript of the first podcast episode, folded neatly, tucked between 2 ribbons of silk. My mother's name was etched simply on the stone. No quotes, no scripture. Just her name, the years she'd lived, and an indentation where the ground had started to sink around the base. I knelt and placed the transcript beside the flowers I brought after all. They tried to cut me from the story, I said, voice low, but you taught me to hold the pen. I sat there for a while, long enough for the breeze to pick up, long enough for the sun to shift, and when I stood to leave, I didn't feel heavy, just still. Weeks passed. I found myself in a different kind of room. Folding chairs, a community center, women seated around me with stories painted in different tones but similar outlines. I led the group, not as an expert, not as a survivor, but as someone who had stopped waiting to be invited to her own life. One woman, older than me by at least 15 years, raised her hand near the end of our first session. "How do you heal from betrayal like that?" she asked, her voice more exhausted than angry. I thought about it. Then I smiled. "You stop waiting for the apology," I said, "and you start building the life they thought you couldn't." They nodded. They understood. That night, a local station aired a short segment on podcasts that were helping women find their voices. Mine was included. Vernon watched from his living room, alone. The anchor quoted me directly. "You don't need to stay where you're not seen, not even if they call it home." He muted the television, walked to the window, and stared out across the lawn. The hydrangeas were blooming again. He said nothing, and I didn't need him to. Because I'd said everything I needed. They said I was unfit to inherit. But I did. I inherited myself. And that was always the real story. They closed the door. I rebuilt the house. And this time, the windows were wide open.